So welcome to this GitHub RoadShow event with better development environments with Codespaces, with my colleague Matthias, who is going to speak today. Can we have the next slide, please?
Yes.
Or maybe not.
There you go. I was fiddling with the audio.
Yeah, so most of you have been in our roadshows before, but this is, I think, is the 5th event we do. We try to do it bi-weekly. And as of now, it's virtual. We will see what will happen in the future after Corona, but we'll probably continue doing at least this event virtual. And we'll try to limit it to maximum of 60 minutes. Next slide, please. A little bit about us, Solidify. We are partners with Microsoft since way back, but since about a year and a half ago, we became more and more involved with GitHub, and we think it's a really interesting tool, and we believe that that is the future. And we're going to show you some stuff later on. The next event we're doing is actually going to do integration between Azure DevOps and GitHub. That will be the event in 2 weeks. But we work with DevOps and try to help our customers become more efficient with working with their tools and produce better software in the end. Next slide, please. And these are the events we have done so far about GitHub, and they are all recorded, and I will post the link to the recordings afterwards so you can listen to them afterwards if you missed those. And if you have other ideas, or if you would like to speak on the events, so please contact us with topics or something like that, and maybe we can fit you in as well. Next slide, please. Over to you, Matthias. Thank you.
Right. Oh, thank you, Magnus. So yeah, I'm Matthias. Most of you have probably met me at some point. Here's a picture of me surfing on the internet, I suppose. I work as, I guess, officially the CTO at Solidify. So I work with teams and help them improve their engineering skills to become better at building and delivering software. And I've been doing that for a long time now as a developer and as a process consultant, an architect, and all of that. So for me, it's really a passion to help teams move forward and get more stuff done. So that's why I'm a little bit extra excited to join today and to share some thoughts on how we can improve our local development environments. So that's what we will have a look at in this session then. So my thinking here is building software can be hard. There's a lot of things to think about to build a good product, but managing your local development, that shouldn't be a difficult thing. But I mean, honestly, we spend quite a lot of time improving or getting our local development environment set up, and that becomes a problem many times. So if it is complicated, we might not do it. So things might not get done. If it's complicated, we might not do all the things that we need to work properly on a project, and that might cause problems with dependencies and cause weird results further down in the chain. So in the spirit of shifting left, trying to capture problems as early as possible in the process, I think it's very important to look at how the environment we develop in works and make sure that we improve that as well as we can. Because if we start to reflect on this sentence here, how long does it take to start working on a thing? If I need to start working on my project, what do I need to do? Sometimes I might be completely fresh on the team, a new employee, then yeah, first I need to get a new machine so I can start doing something. I need to install tools, need to configure the tools. I probably want to install the same tools and configurations as my teammates to develop similarly to them. So you don't end up in the tabs versus spaces war unnecessarily. Like, yeah, I don't like your settings, so I will reformat the code every time I commit, and then when the next guy downloads the code, it's not according to his or her style. So there's a lot of things that can potentially take time from us, preventing us to do, should I say, useful stuff rather than fiddling around with our local environments. And yeah, for me, if I start on a new project, I can probably be up and running quite quickly. But if I go to an arbitrary project in a repository, it usually takes some time. And why is that so? One thing is typically that I don't really know what to start. If I walk up to a repository, how should I get started? Probably not so much documentation. So I guess I will just have to try to figure out what it is, and then come up with what tools I need to start working on the thing. Hopefully those tools doesn't compete with other tools I've already installed, so I end up with some kind of dependency hell. And all of this, I mean, takes a lot of time. And switching between environments and switching between projects can be even worse, because then you have to make sure that things doesn't break, or that your machine can be capable of handling what your project needs. So a lot of reasons to why managing your local environment can take some time. And I will use a couple of examples. So just to illustrate the point, here's one of our open source projects, a migration tool for moving from Jira to Azure DevOps. That's a nice tool. It's open source. But when I prepared for this presentation, I just tried to see that, yeah, let's see that we're not behind and not living as we preach. But scrolling down here, I can't really see anything on how to get started, other than, yeah, contributions are welcome, fork the repository, fix stuff, but there's nothing that really says, oh, how should I do that? So there's room for improvement. And if I get past this hurdle and really want to start working on this, I get some help here to see that this is a C# project. Good. I know I have installed Visual Studio, so I can probably start coding. But then I really need to dig into this and start figuring out where to start. So there's a lot of work I need to do to get to the first line of code to contribute. So that's something we really should try to improve. And this with continuous improvement, I think, is a really important thing. So I mean, it's quite easy to just sit back and say that I don't really have to switch project that often. Maybe I don't have to update to the latest versions of frameworks and packages so often. So yeah, maybe I'll just sit still. So I found this picture the other day. I think it's kind of interesting that if you look at it, if you just do 1% improvements every day, it leads up to an improvement of 38% or 37% than what you started with. So I mean, the small things do really matter. So we should continue to improve. And if we don't, if we actually make things worse by not updating dependencies and staying up to date with a fresh environment, so it's easy to keep developing, and our performance declines by 1%, we actually lose 97% of our performance. So just food for thought. that small things matter, and we need to keep improving. So what can we do to improve them? So going back to my example with the Jira migrator, we can obviously do a lot of things there. To begin with, we can have a proper README file that explains what to do, maybe a checklist on what to install. But that's a bit tedious to maintain. It's a manual process, error prone. So we should probably do better than that. Internally, we used Chocolatey, that package manager for Windows, quite a lot. So if you need to set up a new environment, you can run a script that uses Chocolatey to download and install tools. And that's pretty handy, but that as well gets, it's easy to get to have it get out of date. Doesn't cover user preference as well. So it's automated, but not ideal. And still it's running on my local machine, so it's depending on what environment I use. So obviously, in our team, we have folks working on Mac and PCs. So my Chocolatey script doesn't necessarily work perfectly on a Mac. So maybe we think harder, and another option could be to use virtual machines. Let's say we spin up development environments in Azure or any cloud, then that's quite an interesting improvement. Then we can standardize that environment, create templates. Then we can just use RDP to connect to it. So it doesn't really matter if we have a Mac or PC, we can just remote into the virtual machine. And that certainly helps, but that also becomes a maintenance issue. There's needs to update the templates. If there are security concerns, need to patch the images and whatnot. And you end up with a sort of a specialist competence just maintaining the development environments. So that's an additional cost and bottleneck. So I guess the best option we have right now for many teams is to use Docker. I think that's a really nice solution. We get to define in an abstract way how an environment is set up. So we can define in the Docker file what base image we use. Do we use a .NET Core image, or do we use a Linux image? Which tools do we use? And we can automate the setup of such an environment. That's a little bit work, of course, but also this is something running locally, so it's depending on us having enough capacity to run it in a good way on our local machine. Doesn't necessarily integrate super well into our development environments. So it's a great tool and can be used for many things, but again, a bit of work, and it doesn't suit all purposes. So this is something I've been thinking about a lot and try to optimize, and others, most of you here are probably thinking about that as well at times, and if not, at least get frustrated when you want to contribute somewhere and you don't feel you really have the power to do it because there's hurdles everywhere to get started. And then companies like Microsoft and GitHub are obviously also thinking hard about how we can be efficient at building stuff, getting stuff done, and not just sitting and waiting for installers or environments to become available. So the thing we wanted to talk about today is a technology from Microsoft and GitHub called Codespaces. It's been around for a while, and it's been called Visual Studio Codespaces and associated with Azure and Visual Studio quite heavily, and that has now been expanded, let's say, to also be a part of GitHub. So for I guess half a year or so, there's been a public preview that you could apply to start using this technology in GitHub and with GitHub repositories. This is now shifting a little bit. There was an announcement just recently, last week, that the two initiatives that are quite similar will merge. So they will just be called Codespaces. It could be good to know. And it should, I guess, cover all the possibilities that both sides have been thinking about. But again, we're not the product group here. We're just the consultants using the tool. So I'll focus on what it can bring to the table and how we've been looking at this so far. So Codespaces is a technology where behind the scenes in GitHub, a virtual machine or a Docker container gets spun up, and it will handle your local development environment. So it gives us a lot of interesting benefits. So we get a cloud-based development environment, really nice provisioned. So we can define how that thing should work, and then we can create it on demand. It requires very little hands-on interaction. So I don't know if we should call it setup free, but for users, it's very instant access to an environment that's compatible and suitable for developing the thing I'm interested in. And since it's essentially a template, it will also become very consistent in the way it works. So one big problem teams have is to keep everyone's dependencies in sync. So we don't end up with me using one version of a tool, writing something, getting it to work, Magnus using another, and it works slightly differently, or when he downloads the latest code, stuff doesn't work for him. So with a consistent definition of a dev environment that can be set up and configured on demand, we can get a lot of help keeping fresh environments. So ideally, it's like you get a brand new machine to develop anytime, and I really like that idea because I mean, you know, when you install a new machine, then everything is fast. There's nothing extra installed that you don't need. It slows down things. So instead of having to reinstall your machine every 6 months or so to get that fresh experience, Codespaces might be an option for us. This can also be used to help onboarding new team members. So it's quick to get started. I can just walk up to a repository and create a development environment suitable for that. I get a lot of head start. Since it's cloud-based, I will also be able to work from anywhere. And this has a lot of interesting potentials as well. Like we can resonate about that in the end.
A short question, Matthias. This
Sure.
is for Git repositories in GitHub, right? How about Azure repos?
So what we look at today is for Git in GitHub. That's right. Visual Studio Codespaces was more generic, I guess, or is more generic. But now these two approaches are merging. So yeah, I don't know what will be the end result, but right now it's GitHub and
wild
Git
guess
repos.
Is that it would probably work on Azure repos in the future. Just a wild guess from my side.
Yeah, I think that will be a limitation if it doesn't. But yeah, again, I don't know. Since it's a controlled environment, it's also an interesting potential that you can spin it up in GitHub and access it remotely. But it also works the other way around, that it is a controlled environment, so it's not going to be able to access anything on my machine or in my environment. So that can be something that we discussed can be very useful if you have more secured environments where you don't want accidental access to peripheral environments. You get more in control of this. But then it is a full-fledged environment, so it will have a front end. It uses today, what we will see today, it uses VS Code. Visual Studio Codespaces, as the name implies. You can also work in Visual Studio, but the GitHub Codespaces works with VS Code as for now. And then we'll also look at that it has also a really nice web-based UI. And in the backend, it's running this container that will execute things. It has the server capabilities that we're used to have in our IDE. So it compiles, and you have the debugger. You can run things in the environment. So there's a lot of interesting things that you can use it for. And then since it's part of the Git repo, as you will see, it very nicely integrates. So you don't have to do multi sign-on. You can have your preferences flow from GitHub if you use dot files, for instance. And then an additional, we call it cream on the cake, nice integration with collaboration tools like Git obviously is integrated because that's where we start. But also tools like live sharing, where you can create a session and connect to that throughout through different local IDs. So you can have your friend use his or hers VS Code and connect to your Codespaces session and collaborate. So right, there's a lot of potential here. Okay. And what better than just starting to look at it? So I want to walk through a couple of different flows. So what I have now is that I have Codespaces enabled on my account. So I'm in the private or public preview. We'll talk a little bit about that at the end. How you can apply. So I have this Codespaces feature in with my account. So what happens then is that when I go to a repository in GitHub, I can go to the clone or code section here, and here's usually where I just clone the URL, download the code to my machine, and start working. But now I can also have another option that I can open this with Codespaces. If I have a Codespace already for this repository, it will be listed here. I don't, so then I will just click on create the Codespace. And what happens now is that it will initiate the Codespace. So in the background, it's spinning up a Docker container, installing tools, and so on to give me a starting environment. I will show you what we have prepared in this case, and now you see it's spinning up. So it took a couple of seconds to get started. It's still working, but if I know that for my repo I install a bunch of extensions and tools, it takes a couple of minutes. I go get a cup of coffee and while it's doing that, and then I can start working. So what we see while it's working now is that we get a web browser that looks like VS Code, right? So it's booting up. Now the editor is loaded. I have access to the source code, all that good stuff. I can start coding. It's still initiating things or loading extensions. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but it took roughly a minute to get an environment up and running where I can start coding on this project. So I could immediately start exploring the code. As we see here, we get the usual VS Code experience. So I get extension integration. Now we have some extension that gives me information about my check-ins and so on. But it is the full editor in the background. It's still loading, so it's a little bit slower now in the beginning. But as you can see, we get IntelliSense and all the good stuff that we should expect from from an environment. This is a .NET project. So if I want to compile it, I can run .NET run or .NET build, for instance. So I have, as we can see here in the console, a terminal. This seems to be based on a Unix or Linux machine, which it is. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And it has some tools. So it looked like it had the .NET tools installed and a few other things. And this is kind of what you get out of the box. So we get the editor, we get a base set of tools, and that's great. We can get started in about a minute. So really like that speed to get to first line of code. So maybe that's a new metric, like we have lead time and cycle time. So maybe we should have a metric to define how long it takes to write the first line of code. Maybe that's a measurement of how good our internal development process is. But anyway, so I got an editor. I can start doing stuff, but it didn't quite work. So in this case, to begin with, I ran the command from the wrong location. So I need to jump into the source folder. I can actually change my color theme here a little bit as well. This has been a little bit flaky, so now it doesn't really load. Okay, let's not bother with that then. But you can set the themes usually, but today it's a little bit flaky. But hopefully you can see some examples in the next demo. But anyway, so I was going to go into my source code folder and then just try to run .NET build again, and then just show you that that worked. But hey, this was a .NET framework application, not .NET Core. So then the right tool wasn't installed in this image. So it's a good start, but it doesn't quite meet my needs. So then we need to think about what can we do to solve this. So what happens now when I just walk up to any arbitrary repository and then go to code and click open with Codespaces is that it loads default Codespace environment. And
Matthias,
again, what I said.
Can we take a question from Alf here?
Yeah, of course we can.
So Alf says, I might have missed this, but if the solution requires a VPN or similar setup to access resources, can this be automated or simplified with Codespaces?
It probably depends, but it is a Docker container running. So whatever you can do in a Docker container, I assume you can achieve. So if you can create the outbound connections and establish what you need, then I guess you can.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. All right, so let's go back to see where we were. So we had, just like this is an arbitrary repository, I can go and say open with Codespaces and start a Codespace. It will then use a default template for the definition of that Codespace. And in this repository VS Code dev containers, there's a set of templates that we can use. So by default, it's using one that installs a set of tools. And I don't remember if this was the right place, but in the end, it will bootstrap and install a core set of tools like .NET Core, installs the Golang, Python compiler, and so on. So we get a good set of starting environments. But let's say we have something else, and I think also we want to be more specific. So we're not depending on GitHub being in sync with us. That's probably not so likely it will happen. So instead, we want to define how our code space works in our repository. So if our product isn't just about editing simple scripts or running a simple application, then we should create our definition of things. And what we do then is that I'm going to pick a pre-baked repository I have, is that we do a couple of things. We add a folder called .dev container, and in this folder we add a JSON file that describes how the specific container for this repository should behave. And it contains of a couple of different sections. So why not have a look? It contains of a section that defines how the Codespace environment is set up. And this is done by running a Docker file. So the Docker file defines the machine we will execute on. And then we can also describe the configuration. So in this case, we are using a bunch of extensions that we want to use for consistency when developing the application, like linters, integrations with other systems like the GitHub pull request extension that we have here. That's something the team has agreed is a good thing to use to collaborate. We want to have live sharing options enabled, so we install that extension. So any extension that we want pre-baked on the image when we start it up, we add to this list. And then we can customize the user experience a bit further, so we can add other settings for the environment. And we can also do a few other things like defining which ports are we using for developing this system. So maybe that's something we need to do to set up app ports for communication between containers and environments, like Alf mentioned. If we want to debug the thing that we run in this code space, we need to be able to expose it. So the container is quite basic in what it does. Like for those of you who are working with containers know. So it will work as a backend to execute the work we do when developing. But when we want to test something, we typically want to expose APIs or web apps and whatnot over certain ports, so we can reach them. So this file controls all of the behaviors of the environment. Like how is it set up? How is it configured? How is it used when running it? And whatever happens when we do this setup is all up to us. So for instance, in this case, this is a .NET Core application, ASP.NET Core. So we decided to use a simple Docker image as a base image for that.
Here's a short question from Christine here. What about third-party bot components? Do I need a custom-based Docker image for those, or can I add them to a list of extensions?
Yeah, probably depends. So if you want to pre-bake an image and use that, why not? That's good. If you have applications that you want to install, then this is kind of the way you want to do that. You start with a base image, configure Docker in the way you configure Docker, and then potentially you run a setup script. So in this case, the setup script will bootstrap what gets installed. So here we can add all sorts of tools that we want to install on the machine. So that could be one way to get the third-party apps installed. And then if there are extensions in VS Code, we use the Docker or the Codespace dev container file to define that. But here we can do all sorts of things. So I guess again for Alf's question, if we want to expose behaviors in the Docker container, maybe establish some networking things, we can do that according to whatever the base container is capable of doing. So if it's a Linux environment, we use Linux commands to do what we need to do. But I'm just guessing. So all qualified guesses. So what then happens in this case, since this container is a little bit more advanced, this repository is enhanced with a dev container. What happens now if I go and open Codespaces, it will use the container definition. And I already have one of these going. So I'll just click on the one I already have. So in this case, it's going to connect to the Codespace. And like you saw in the glimpse of an eye there, it said started 5 hours ago. So it had already done this initialization, installed all the tools, configure my environment. But then the behavior right now is that it goes to sleep after half an hour. So it's been hibernating for a little bit. So now, fingers crossed, Codespaces will just go and wake it up and connect back to it. And here we can see it actually picked up my theme changes, which is nice. And it's actually so nice that it's also using my my GitHub account. So that's what get the Git stuff going. And then I've also enabled sync and logged in to use synchronization between my different VS Code instances. So in my case, I have my Visual Studio Code running locally. It should also be synced and logged in with the same account. So I don't know if I'm pushing my luck here, but if I go and change to a different session or a different theme, it will pick that up in the local environment as well. But that's just common functionality in VS Code.
One more question, Matthias. Can we use Windows-based containers, or is it only Linux? That's from Manne.
So for the GitHub Codespaces, it's only Linux containers during the preview, and then what happens after that, yeah, I don't know. But with the Visual Studio Codespaces, you could use a Windows environment as well. So in my previous repo where we developed the Jira tool, we still have some .NET framework dependencies, so we would have wanted to use a Windows container for that. But currently in the preview, we only get Linux.
Okay, thanks.
All right, so we're back in the editor. I was fiddling with settings just to show you that we have those options. I've set up an integrated debugger here, or integrated my debugger with the VS Code. So I just hit F5, and it will now just run my project in Debug. And this is again working just like it would do in my local environment. Then, if you recall, in my dev container, we specified that this application uses some ports. So we want to forward that if we want to test the application. So now I started this one in Debug, and now we can see that in the debug output here, it says that now .NET Core is loaded and it's listening on this port. If I go and click on the link, it will redirect to my browser, so I can test the thing running now in my Visual Studio Code. And here we see that GitHub is doing some magic to handle the port forwarding and proxying. So in a short bit, it will render the output from the session. So that's pretty cool. What's also cool is that if I share this link with you guys in the chat, you can try to click it, but hopefully it will not work. So it should be sandboxed. So it's my session. It's only me working on this that should be able to access the environment. So it should be as protected as my local environment, which is nice. just to prove that it is actually running correctly, I can set a breakpoint, reload the page, and like we see here, we get a breakpoint in the editor, so we can debug and all that good stuff. So maybe we have questions, but before we ask any questions, I just wanted to show the nice integration with live sharing as well. So I'll start a collaboration session here, and using live share. This extension was already installed, right? So we had that going. Actually post that in the chat as well. So Magnus, why don't you connect to it and see if you can join my little session here?
Absolutely.
So while we do that, it might take Magnus a minute or so to get his VS Code instance up and running. Do we have any other questions so far?
We had a question for Alf. Can you open this up for other to test or mobile device testing?
I'm not entirely sure, honestly, since this port forwarding seems to be locked down for your session. But when we start working with live sharing, Magnus, when he joins, he will also get access to this. So I don't think it's really not an option for test environments, in my opinion, or what I learned so far. It's more like a way to develop and collaborate while developing. So how is it going on your end?
Well, pretty good. I think I am in now. So let's do something.
Yeah,
let's change hello friend to hello stop. Yeah, cool.
This is really nice. And
so I guess I can try the application as well.
Yeah, why don't you? See if you can browse to the link we have here.
I don't see the link. Let's see where I can find that. Problems, outputs.
You open up your debug console.
Yeah, but I can't see anything there. It's kind of strange.
Okay, so.
But anyway, when we tried this earlier, I clicked on the link and then I could run Matthias' application from my.
So if you try just going to localhost 5000, is not working for you?
I don't know. Let's try it.
Yeah, let's try. So you should get the port forwarding in the same way.
It's thinking.
It's thinking.
Oh, I couldn't do it this time. But
okay.
Never mind. It worked earlier today, and I can run Matthias' application from my Visual Studio.
That's a good start.
Yep.
And obviously, depending on what you load in your session, if you're building .NET Core apps, it works like this. If you had your front-end code working, you just use your web development environment and start a dev web server, and it will host some content. You port forward it, and it works just like working on your local VS Code. If you want to use Codespaces but still use your local editor for some reason, you can do so. Just click on Codespaces in the bottom left. Then you can say open in VS Code, and then it will open up the project in Visual Studio Code. So not live sharing, but you get a direct connection with the container in the backend. And this one uses a remoting extension to handle that. So I want to show a couple of other things. So you just trust me that it will work and it will be beautiful. So next thing I wanted to show is that now that we've done this, we saw that we can customize the container that gets set up and the experience by using a dev container file and a Docker file. If we want to get more inspiration on how to set it up, this repository has a lot of starting points, even some starting applications if you want to play around with it. But in the containers folder here, we got a bunch of base setups for different environments. So if you're developing some front-end code in, or if you're using Dart, let's say, then you can go here and look at the container definition and see how it sets up the environment for you. So next, I just want to go back to my repository.
We have a question from Jesper here during that time. Will code